Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Jessica Froese, and I'm really thrilled to be presenting my research at the CRRF conference on Treaty 2 territory, the traditional land of the Dakota, Ojibwe, Cree, Anishinaabe, and Métis people. So my presentation is titled A Complex Migration Story as Told by the Youth of Tumbler Ridge, BC. And this research was part of my master's thesis, which I completed this summer at UNBC, supervised by Greg Halseth. So just to quickly outline the presentation, I will start with just a little bit of background and then introduce my research focus. I'll then outline the case study community before spending a lot of time on my key findings and takeaways, and then wrap up with some recommendations. So the basis of this research is that rural communities are changing and that we are in control of our own futures. So following World War II, Canada shifted its political focus toward nation building through a Keynesian public policy approach focused on community and economic development. And in BC, this goal was achieved through industrial natural resource development, resulting in the creation of resource towns such as Tumbler Ridge. So we saw this period of growth continue until the 1980s or 90s, when the pressures of an increasingly globalized economy, ongoing trade disputes, and a global recession all contributed to the adoption of a neoliberal public policy approach and really major economic restructuring. So the issue of youth outmigration is really important in this context because since this economic and political restructuring, service infrastructure has aged, the workforce is retiring, and many youth and young families have migrated out of these communities. Therefore, the changing resource economy combined with an outdated service infrastructure has completely changed the nature of work in rural and small town places for the young people that are seeking employment and quality of life within them. So from this story, I kind of had heard that a lot of people were pretty sure that we already knew why youth leave these rural communities. Basically, access to post-secondary institutions and better career opportunities in larger cities. But as a leaver myself, I didn't feel like this was the whole story. So I dedicated my master's to exploring the topic. And I actually just wanted to start right away with my main finding. So while education and employment opportunities are, of course, important to rural teens, I actually found that sense of place and feelings of belonging played a much larger role in youth migration planning, including the decision to return to their community. So now we can backtrack and take a look at how I got to that conclusion. So the focus of my research specifically was exploring senior high school students' feelings about staying, leaving, or returning to their community of Tumbler Ridge. And my objective was to tell the story of those on the verge of making this migration decision and also understanding the community factors that push and pull those plans. So specifically, my three research questions were, what are the push and pull factors of Tumbler Ridge for young people? What are the future education, employment, and migration goals of youth in Tumbler Ridge? And then how is Tumbler Ridge supporting their local youth or not? So for context, Tumbler Ridge is a small community in northeastern BC on the foothills of the Rocky Mountains with a population of about 2,600 people. And Tumbler Ridge is on the traditional territories of the Dene-Zaa, Saulteaux, Tsay-Keh-Neh, Cree, and Métis nations within Treaty 8 territory. So Tumbler Ridge is actually BC's newest resource town. It was incorporated in 1981 to support a local coal mining workforce, and it was actually built by the federal and provincial governments. Unlike earlier resource towns, Tumbler Ridge was built specifically on social design principles, and so this was to achieve really high residential satisfaction, high social cohesion, and then also low labor turnover. And this was done through extensive recreational facilities, resident-focused infrastructure, and crime prevention street planning. So the planners did really excel in site planning and neighborhood design, but no principles to ensure economic diversification were implemented. And we've seen the coal mines open and close over the decades and the population fluctuate along with that. But Tumbler Ridge is more than its coal mining roots. The community is characterized by its natural and remote beauty in the mountains. There's more waterfalls and hiking trails than you can count. They also have dinosaur footprints and fossils that have made it an UNESCO Global Geopark site, and there's been a lot of recent development in wind energy. So to explore the issue of youth retention in Tumbler Ridge, I employed a mixed methods exploratory case study grounded in community-based research that basically incorporated two main components. So of course, a document analysis to gain an understanding of the context and of the community. So including academic literature, as well as municipal plans and reports, the local newspaper, which is still running since the town's creation, community documents, as well as economic and demographic data from Statistics Canada and BC Stats. And then the second part was community visits to gather experiences and perspectives. So I was in the community over several months and basically employed two methods of interviews and focus groups. So interviews were done with the staff of community organizations that provide programs, services, or employment to local youth, as well as teachers and staff at the local high school and school district administration. And then the focus groups were conducted with youth between the ages of 15 and 19. And so current high school students, as well as recent graduates. And this included youth who grew up in Tumbler Ridge, as well as some youth who had recently moved there. So pretty diverse perspectives. So to jump into the results, my first question asked about the push and pull factors of Tumbler Ridge. So in order of significance, the pull factors are small town lifestyle, which included aspects of rural living and family connections, the natural environment and outdoor recreation, community planning, particularly walkability and green spaces, high-paying jobs, and low cost of living. The push factors are remoteness and lack of amenities, education, which included aspects of high school and post-secondary, a lack of economic diversification, housing primarily around the rental market, and a lack of anonymity. Now, the important thing that I want you to notice from these lists is that cultural, environmental, and community factors are what are pulling young people to Tumbler Ridge rather than economic factors, and that the most significant push factor is not a lack of economic opportunity, but actually remoteness. So the second question asked about the education, employment, and migration goals of these youth. So I found that post-secondary education was very important, and actually all youth participants expressed a desire to pursue post-secondary of some kind, which when compared with a lot of the rural literature is pretty unique. Literature often discusses rural students as lower achieving and less likely to pursue higher education than urban students. And this is also a really important finding for Tumbler Ridge because pursuing post-secondary requires youth to leave the community. However, when youth were asked if they would stay in Tumbler Ridge to complete their post-secondary if it was available, many of them said they would, and several are going to nearby institutions. So what is the bigger story here? The important pattern that I saw was that youth who demonstrated a very strong sense of place to Tumbler Ridge were the ones who planned to stay northern and or rural, not necessarily returning to Tumbler Ridge, but staying in those types of communities, while youth with a weak sense of place tended to desire southern or urban communities. And this was completely regardless of education and employment goals. So to sum up these two findings, as expected, when I asked youth just about migration goals, they named the city that they planned to attend post-secondary or begin their careers, which were all outside of Tumbler Ridge and a lot outside of the north. But when they were pushed on why that specific school or why that city is when youth began to discuss lifestyle and quality of life factors. So education and employment opportunities were important to these youth, but only when they fit alongside these other factors related to lifestyle and quality of life. So education and employment goals do initiate the desire to migrate, but sense of place factors determine where and why youth go, including the desire to return to Tumbler Ridge later. So therefore, economic development must coincide with cultural, social, and recreational community development if you want to actually retain young people. So the third question asked how Tumbler Ridge is supporting its local youth, which of course was the biggest section of my results chapter, so I'll spare you the details, but I want to basically take a step back and show you what this question really asked at the root, which is how does Tumbler Ridge build and support their youth's sense of place And for the sake of this audience, how can we emulate that in other rural communities? And so the answer is through fostering community connections and building communities where young people feel like they belong. So Tumbler Ridge is excelling kind of in 4 main areas. So first, education and employment support, particularly through linking local employment and work experience opportunities with their local high school. And they have a bunch of innovative programs that do this, but one of my favorites is their go-kart program, where the grade 9s are split into teams and they have to build go-karts for the better part of the school year. So they have to craft funding proposals that they present to local government to get funding. They take a field trip to a college and learn welding. They bring in local mechanics. They design logos in art class, and then they have a big race at the end of the year. Another area is in infrastructure and community planning. So those social design principles built into the community in the 80s are still really appreciated by youth. Walkability and green spaces means freedom when you're a teenager. And then environment and outdoor recreation. I think this is just a huge piece of Northern BC identity and rural identity. And Tumbler Ridge really fosters this, not only through like volunteer maintained trail systems, but also through annual community events that bring everyone together, such as their really intense cross-country run, the Emperor's Challenge. And then in social and recreational planning, they have many structured and unstructured programs. They have a youth center in their community center, a teen summer reading club, to name a few. However, not all youth demographics are necessarily supported. So the majority of these initiatives still kind of target one main demographic, and that is youth that are interested in outdoor recreation, natural resources, kind of generally fit that more traditional rural northern lifestyle. So youth who express more interest in things like the arts or technology, or who self-identified as a minority in the community, tended to feel less engaged and empowered. And so this is a reminder to check and recheck who your development is for, because youth is not just one homogenous group that you can check off. Which leads right into my recommendations. So the first recommendation, of course, is to listen to your youth. Youth representative positions are a straightforward way to meaningfully engage youth, or youth councils if you have enough population. And they can be implemented by all kinds of groups, city council, local institutions, youth services. And then you can utilize those representatives or councils to develop a youth strategy or plan to guide the future development efforts of your organization. A big one I found was increasing teen-specific programming, not just assuming that teens will go to programs created for children or for adults. So implementing things like minimum and maximum age restrictions, holding events in third spaces, these types of things actually do make a difference. For municipalities, I always recommend developing a resident recruitment plan that specifically includes teens and young adults, not only young families with children. Again, to guide future development efforts and ensure that they align with this population's more unique priorities. And then finally, our rural communities must continue to put pressure on provincial governments, because some of the major barriers around youth outmigration are systemic and outside of municipal jurisdiction, so also taking that advocacy role. So to wrap up, this research demonstrated that sense of place is important in the migration planning of youth, including the decision to stay rural. Education and employment opportunities are often assumed to be the most significant factor in youth migration planning and are often the primary suggestion for youth-focused community development, but I found differences in youth's priorities. So my research highlights that quality of life and sense of place were the most significant factors in determining where youth plan to migrate and why. So rather than this pattern of rural to urban migration in search of better opportunities, the migration goals of youth reflected their sense of place in Tumbler Ridge. Therefore, community development that focuses on supporting youth sense of place is both a retention and a recruitment strategy. Thank you very much.